The stars looked different when you knew you were making history, and Commander Park Jun-ho watched them through the viewing port of the UES Harmony as they approached the alien homeworld of Kethmora. 3 years had passed since Earth first detected. The radio signals from the Vextar Empire and 18 months since the first contact protocols were established through long-range communications, and now humanity was about to meet their first alien civilization face-to-face. Ambassador Choi Hee-won stood beside him reviewing her notes one final time, and her diplomatic team had spent months preparing for this moment, and the weight of representing all humanity rested on her shoulders, but she carried it with grace and determination that inspired. Everyone around her, Dr. Kim Min-ji, moved between the cargo holds checking the gifts Earth had prepared for this historic meeting and medical technology that could cure diseases and agricultural innovations that could feed millions and artistic works that showed the beauty of human creativity filled the storage bays, and every item had been chosen to demonstrate humanity's peaceful intentions and desire for mutual cooperation. The Vextar had seemed genuinely interested in establishing diplomatic relations during their communications, and they had provided star charts and basic information about their empire, which controlled 3 star systems and included several different alien species, and their messages spoke of trade opportunities and cultural exchange and shared defense against unknown threats from deep space. Captain Lee Dong-hyun commanded the escort fleet that surrounded the Harmony, and 5 ships carried Earth's most advanced defensive systems, but their weapons were powered down and their shields configured for minimal energy output to show the aliens that humanity came in peace and not as conquerors. The alien homeworld grew larger in their viewports, and Kethmora was a massive planet with purple oceans and silver continents and 3 moons that reflected strange light across its surface, and orbital stations surrounded the world like metallic rings, and massive ships moved between them in patterns that suggested a highly organized civilization. Junho received the first transmission from Vextar Traffic Control, and their language had become familiar through months of study, but hearing it spoken by actual aliens still sent chills down his spine, and the voice was rough and guttural but understandable. As it guided them toward a designated docking facility, Ambassador Choi gathered her team in the main conference room, and her face showed no fear, despite knowing that everything could go wrong, and Dr. Kim Min-ji sat beside her reviewing the xenobiology reports they had compiled, and the Vexitar were large humanoid creatures with thick gray skin and powerful builds, and their culture seemed to value strength and military prowess, but they had responded positively to human diplomatic overtures. The docking process took 3 hours, and Vextar ships surrounded them during the approach, but kept their distance and showed no hostile intentions, and their technology appeared roughly equivalent to Earth's, though built with different design principles. That emphasized function over form war. Chief Grak-Thul himself waited at the docking port when the human delegation disembarked, and he stood nearly 3 meters tall with ceremonial armor that reflected his high rank, and his eyes were intelligent, despite his intimidating appearance, and he greeted Ambassador Choi with what seemed to be genuine respect. The first day of negotiations went better than anyone had dared hope, and the Vextar showed genuine interest in human medical technology and agricultural techniques, and they offered star charts of unexplored regions and mineral rights on asteroid belts, rich in rare elements, and both sides seemed to find common ground for mutually beneficial cooperation. Dr. Kim Min-ji spent hours studying Vextar biology and culture, and she learned that they had conquered their current territory over several centuries, but claimed they only fought against aggressive species that threatened peaceful civilizations, and they spoke of wanting to establish a zone of stability in their region of space. Captain Lee maintained constant communication with the escort fleet, and everything appeared normal, and Vexitar ships kept respectful distances, and their scans showed no hostile preparations, and the alien traffic control continued to provide helpful guidance and updates. The second day brought discussions of technology exchange, and the Vextar demonstrated their own innovations, including advanced metallurgy and energy storage systems that could benefit Earth's expanding space program, and Ambassador Choi began drafting preliminary agreements that would establish formal diplomatic relations between Earth and the Vextar Empire. Junho noticed subtle changes in Vextar behavior during the second evening, and guards appeared more frequently in corridors, and conversations stopped when humans approached, and something in the air felt different. though he could not identify exactly what had changed, War Chief Grakthul invited the human delegation to a formal ceremony on the third day, and he explained that Vextar tradition required public acknowledgement of new alliances, and the event would be broadcast throughout their empire to announce humanity's acceptance as a respected partner. Ambassador Choi agreed enthusiastically and saw this as the perfect culmination of their diplomatic mission, and Dr. Kim viewed it as an unprecedented opportunity to study Vextar social customs, and the entire human team prepared for what they believed would be a historic celebration of interspecies cooperation. The ceremony hall was massive and could hold thousands of beings, and representatives from various alien species under Vextar rule attended, along with military, officials, and government leaders, and the atmosphere seemed festive with colorful banners and traditional music that filled the space with alien but pleasant sounds. War Chief Grakthul addressed the assembled crowd in the Vextar language and translation. Devices provided the human delegation with real-time interpretation, and he spoke of new alliances and the benefits of cooperation and expanding the Empire's sphere of influence through peaceful means. Ambassador Choi stepped forward when invited to address the gathering, and she spoke eloquently about humanity's hopes for lasting peace and mutual prosperity, and her words were translated for the alien audience and seemed to be well received based on the positive reactions she could observe. The trap was sprung with shocking suddenness, and Vextar guards surrounded the human delegation before anyone could react, and War Chief Grakthul's expression changed from diplomatic friendliness to cold calculation as energy weapons were raised. Toward the humans, Ambassador Choi demanded an explanation, but Grakthul only smiled with predatory satisfaction and explained that humanity had revealed its weakness through its peaceful approach, and that the Vextar Empire expanded through strength, not through negotiations with inferior species. The execution was broadcast live throughout the Vextar Empire and to human ships in orbit, and Dr. Kim Minji managed to send one final data burst to the Harmony before energy beams ended her life along. With Ambassador Choi and the entire diplomatic team, Commander Junho watched in horror from the Harmony's bridge as the transmission showed his friends and colleagues murdered in cold blood while alien crowds cheered, and War Chief Grakthul declared that humanity would make excellent slaves for the Empire's expansion plans. The Vextar fleet immediately moved to attack positions around the human ships, and Junho ordered emergency departure as weapons systems came online and targeted his vessel, and Captain Lee's escort ships fought desperately to buy time for the Harmony to escape. Dr. Kim's final transmission contained devastating intelligence about Vextar military preparations and invasion fleets being assembled and their plans to reach Earth within 6 months, and their belief that humans would surrender quickly when faced with superior force. The Harmony barely escaped the Kethmora system as Vextar ships pursued them, and 2 escort vessels were destroyed covering their retreat. And Junho prepared the most important message in human history as they fled toward the jump point that would take them home. His hands shook as he activated the emergency transmission protocols and looked directly into the camera, knowing that his words would determine humanity's response to this unprovoked act of war and betrayal. This is Commander Park Junho aboard the UES Harmony, transmitting emergency priority 1 to Earth Command, and our diplomatic mission has been terminated with extreme prejudice, and Ambassador Choi Hyawan and her entire team have been executed by Vextar forces, and they are preparing invasion fleets to attack Earth within 6 months. The transmission continued with tactical data and intelligence about Vextar capabilities and their locations, and Dr. Kim's final analysis of their weaknesses, and Junho's voice remained steady, despite his grief and anger, as he delivered the information that would change everything. They wanted to answer our peace with murder, and they think we are weak prey, ready for conquest, and they have made the greatest mistake in their empire's history, and Earth must be warned immediately, because the Vextar are coming, and they expect us to surrender without a fight. The message ended as the Harmony jumped to hyperspace, carrying the last survivors of humanity's first diplomatic contact, and behind them the Vextar celebrated what they believed would be an easy conquest, but they had no idea what they had awakened in the depths of human space. The emergency transmission from Commander Park Jun-ho reached Earth Command exactly 14 hours after the massacre, and within minutes, every government leader on the planet was summoned to the Global Defense Council chambers in Geneva, and the images of Ambassador Choi Hee-won's execution played on screens throughout the facility as shocked officials struggled to comprehend what they were witnessing. General Yang Tae-hyun arrived first, and his face showed no emotion as he reviewed the tactical data that accompanied Junho's message, and 30 years of military experience had taught him to remain calm during crisis. But the footage of human diplomats being murdered in cold blood tested even his legendary composure. Dr. Shin Yuna hurried through the corridors carrying encrypted files that contained information known only to the highest levels of Earth's government, and her Advanced Weapons Research Division had spent decades preparing for possibilities that most humans never imagined, and today those preparations would finally be revealed. Admiral Ko Sung-jin's fleet commanders were already mobilizing when he entered the council chambers, and his face was grim as he reported that every major naval installation on Earth and throughout the solar system was moving to maximum alert status, and defensive positions were being established around critical infrastructure. President Im Dae-ho called the session to order, and his voice carried the weight of representing all humanity as he addressed the assembled leaders, and the images from Kethemora continued playing on the main screen, serving as a constant reminder of why they were gathered. The intelligence briefing revealed the full scope of Vextar intentions, and Dr. Kim Min-ji's final data burst contained detailed scans of their military installations and troop movements and invasion fleet compositions, and their estimated timeline for reaching Earth and their plans for enslaving humanity once resistance was crushed. General Yang stood before the assembly, and his presentation began with a simple question about whether Earth was truly as defenseless as the aliens believed, and the answer would shock even the people who had authorized the programs decades earlier. Every colony ship that had left Earth contained hidden military manufacturing capabilities, and every research station throughout the solar system could be converted to weapons production within weeks, and every civilian vessel larger than a shuttle had concealed defensive systems and emergency protocols for total war mobilization. Dr. Shin activated holographic displays showing Earth's true technological capabilities and quantum weapons research that had been disguised as theoretical physics and nanoswarm fighter production, hidden within asteroid mining operations and planet-killer devices that masqueraded as terraforming equipment. The peaceful facade had been genuine because humanity truly hoped to find friends among the stars, but the species that had survived nuclear weapons and global wars and climate disasters and resource conflicts had learned never to be completely unprepared for violence. Admiral Ko outlined the mobilization timeline, and within 48 hours Earth would have the largest military force in human history, ready for deployment, and shipyards that had been building exploration vessels would convert to warship production, and defensive installations would activate weapons systems that had never been tested in actual combat. The Vextar had made their fatal error by broadcasting the execution and believing that intimidation would weaken human resolve, and instead the images of murdered diplomats had unified the planet in ways that politicians had never managed, and every nation and every faction and every ideology found common cause in the face of alien aggression. Commander Park Jun-ho's ship reached Earth 3 days after the emergency transmission, and he appeared before the Global Defense Council to provide detailed testimony about Vextar capabilities and tactics, and his first-hand observations of their technology and military doctrine and cultural attitudes toward warfare. Dr. Kim Min-ji's research notes revealed critical weaknesses in Vextar defense systems, and their energy shields were designed to repel conventional plasma weapons, but would be vulnerable to quantum manipulation, and their ships relied heavily on centralized computer networks that could be disrupted by targeted cyber attacks. The Council reviewed intercepted Vextar communications that confirmed their invasion timeline and their belief that humanity would surrender after a few orbital bombardments, and their plans to use Earth as a slave labor source for expanding their empire into unexplored regions of space. General Yang presented the military response plan, and Earth would not wait for the invasion, but would strike first using advantages of surprise and superior technology and mobility, and the goal would be complete destruction of Vextar military capabilities and liberation of all species under their control. Dr. Shin revealed the existence of Project Deep Strike and cloaked assault ships that had been secretly constructed over the past decade, and stealth technology that made vessels invisible to known detection methods and weapons systems that could manipulate reality at the quantum level. The vote was unanimous, and every member of the Global Defense Council agreed that humanity would respond to the Vextar threat with overwhelming force, and that no alien empire would ever again mistake human kindness for weakness, and that the galaxy would learn what happened when peaceful intentions were answered with. Murder Admiral Ko received authorization to begin fleet deployment, and ships that had been disguised as cargo haulers revealed hidden weapon systems, and research vessels activated military protocols, and civilian space workers reported to military stations for conversion to warship crews. The transformation was swift and stunning, and within 1 week Earth's space infrastructure had converted from peaceful exploration to total war footing, and manufacturing centers throughout the solar system began producing weapons and ships and equipment designed to fight an interstellar conflict. Recruitment centers opened on every continent, and volunteers flooded in faster than processing systems could handle, and young people who had grown up dreaming of peaceful contact with aliens now prepared to fight for humanity's survival and independence. Dr. Shin's laboratories worked around the clock finalizing weapon systems that had existed only as theoretical designs and quantum disruptors that could tear apart matter at the subatomic level, and nanoswarm fighters that could overwhelm enemy defenses through sheer numbers and adaptive tactics. The first test firing of quantum weapons took place in the outer solar system, and asteroids simply ceased to exist when touched by the energy beams, and the power was carefully measured to ensure that Earth's response would be proportional but devastating, and that the Vextar would understand the consequences of their aggression intelligence. Operations began intercepting Vextar communications throughout their empire, and human agents who had been positioned as traders and researchers for decades activated sleeper protocols and began gathering tactical information about military installations and troop deployments and leadership structures. Commander Park Jun-ho volunteered to lead the first strike force, and his experience with Vextar technology and tactics made him invaluable for planning assault operations, and his personal motivation for revenge against Ambassador Choi's murderers gave him the determination needed for the dangerous mission ahead. The Psychological Warfare Division began preparing broadcasts that would be transmitted throughout Vextar space, and the aliens who had used intimidation and fear to control other species would learn what those emotions felt like when turned against them. Earth's allies throughout the solar system pledged their support, and Mars colonies contributed their mining equipment for conversion to military use, and asteroid belt settlements provided resources and manufacturing capacity, and outer planet research stations became forward operating bases. The Vextar continued their invasion preparations, believing they had 6 months to organize their forces, and that humanity would spend that time in panic and desperate attempts at negotiation, and they had no idea that Earth's response was already crossing interstellar space toward their territory. Admiral Ko's advanced scouts reported successful penetration of Vextar space using stealth technology, and initial reconnaissance confirmed the locations of military targets and slave labor camps and civilian populations, and the intelligence would guide precision strikes that would minimize collateral damage. General Yang received reports from liberated alien prisoners who had escaped Vextar control, and their testimonies revealed centuries of oppression and genocide, and cultural destruction, and the scope of crimes that demanded justice beyond simple military victory. Dr. Shin's final weapons tests exceeded all expectations, and humanity's technological advantages were greater than anyone had imagined, and the Vextar Empire's military technology was decades behind Earth's hidden capabilities, and their defeat was mathematically certain. The Global Defense Council issued humanity's declaration of war, and the message was broadcast throughout known space and translated into every alien language that human scholars could decipher, and the words were simple and direct and left no room for misunderstanding. You executed our ambassadors when they came in peace, and you planned to enslave our species, and you believed we were weak and defenseless, and you have made the greatest mistake in galactic history. And now you will learn what happens when humans decide to fight. The ghost of Terra moved through space like a whisper, and Captain Bae Jahoon watched the sensor displays that showed absolutely nothing, despite his ship being exactly where it should be, and Engineer Park Min-ho's cloaking technology had exceeded every expectation and rendered the assault vessel completely invisible to all known detection methods. 3 weeks had passed since Earth's fleet departed for Vextar space, and the enemy still believed they had months to prepare their invasion. And their communications showed complete confidence that humanity would surrender after minimal resistance, and they had no idea that death was already approaching their territory. Lieutenant Nam Sumin checked her equipment one final time, and her Special Forces team had trained for decades in hostile environment operations, and today they would infiltrate the HFY mining complex, where hundreds of alien slaves worked under Vextar Guard, and the liberation of that facility would announce humanity's arrival in spectacular fashion. The stealth fleet consisted of 12 ships that had been secretly constructed in the outer solar system, and each vessel carried advanced weapons and elite troops and quantum communication systems that allowed instant coordination despite vast distances, and Engineer Park's innovations had made them undetectable to enemy sensors. Captain Bay studied the reconnaissance data that showed HFY's defensive layout and orbital platforms surrounded. The mining asteroid and patrol ships moved in predictable patterns, and the Vextar clearly believed their territory was secure from any possible threat, and their complacency would be their downfall. Dr. Shin Yuna's quantum weapons had been installed on every ship, and the reality-manipulating beams could penetrate any known shielding and destroy targets at the molecular level, and the technology represented humanity's greatest scientific achievement. And today, it would be tested in actual combat. For the first time, the enslaved aliens at HFY belonged to 17 different species, and intelligence reports described conditions that violated every principle of civilized behavior, and workers were beaten and starved and executed for minor infractions, and their suffering demanded immediate justice and liberation. Lieutenant Nam's infiltration team prepared for deployment, and their mission was to disable the facility's communication systems and rescue as many slaves as possible before the main assault began, and her soldiers had volunteered for the most dangerous assignment because they understood what was at stake. Commander Park Jun-ho coordinated the attack from his flagship, and his personal motivation for revenge burned bright. But his tactical planning remained coldly professional, and the Vextar would pay for murdering Ambassador Choi and her team, but the payment would be calculated and precise. The approach to HFY took 18 hours, and the stealth fleet remained completely undetected as they moved into assault positions, and Vextar patrol ships passed within kilometers without realizing that human warships surrounded them, and the element of surprise was complete. Engineer Park monitored the cloaking systems and the quantum field generators that bent light and energy around the ships, and the technology had been theoretical just months ago, but necessity had accelerated development and testing, and today humanity would prove its technological superiority. The Vextar guards at HFY followed their routine schedules and showed no awareness that anything had changed, and their scanners detected nothing unusual, and their communications remained casual and confident, and they discussed plans for Earth's conquest as if it were already accomplished. Captain Bay received the attack authorization, and his voice remained steady as he gave the order that would begin humanity's war of liberation, and the Ghost of Terra dropped its cloak as quantum weapons charged, and the first shots of the conflict would announce Earth's presence with devastating clarity. Lieutenant Nam's team materialized inside the mining complex using personal cloaking devices, and they moved through corridors like shadows and disabled guard posts and communication arrays and opened slave quarters where hundreds of aliens cowered in fear and confusion. The Vextar guards realized something was wrong when their communication systems failed and patrol ships stopped responding, and emergency alarms began sounding, but they had no idea what was happening, and their confusion turned to terror when human soldiers appeared from nowhere. The quantum weapons struck Vextar ships with unprecedented destructive power and energy. Shields that had protected them for centuries simply failed, and hulls dissolved and power cores exploded, and the orbital platforms around HFY were reduced to scattered debris within minutes. Commander Park watched the battle unfold and felt satisfaction at seeing Vextar military forces destroyed, but his greater focus was on the liberation of enslaved beings, and every alien life saved was a victory against the empire that had murdered his friends. The rescue operation proceeded with Clockwork Precision and Lieutenant Nam's teams evacuated slave quarters and provided medical aid and explained that humans had come to liberate them from Vextar oppression, and the aliens' reactions ranged from disbelief to overwhelming gratitude. Dr. Shin's weapons performed beyond all specifications, and Vextar technology proved completely vulnerable to quantum manipulation, and their ships and stations and weapons were destroyed faster than their crews could react, and the technological gap was even greater than Earth scientists had calculated. Engineer Park detected Vextar distress signals attempting to warn other installations, and he activated jamming systems that prevented any communication from leaving the HFY system, and the news of humanity's attack would not reach enemy commanders until it was too late. The aliens at HFY represented species that had been enslaved for generations, and some had forgotten their homeworlds, and others had never known freedom, and their stories of Vexitar cruelty confirmed every horrible report that Earth's intelligence had gathered. Captain Bay coordinated with other strike teams attacking Vexitar installations throughout their territory, and quantum communication allowed instant coordination despite impossible distances, and the simultaneous assault would cripple the Empire's military infrastructure within hours. The liberated aliens provided crucial intelligence about Vextar military dispositions and slave labor, camps and hidden weapons facilities, and their knowledge would guide subsequent operations, and their assistance would prove invaluable for planning the complete liberation of occupied space. Lieutenant Nam discovered evidence of systematic genocide and cultural destruction and biological experiments that violated every principle of sentient rights, and the Vextar had not simply conquered other species, but had attempted to erase their very existence. The battle for HFY ended within 4 hours, and every Vextar military asset in the system had been destroyed, and hundreds of slaves had been freed, and medical teams were treating injuries and malnutrition and psychological trauma from years of oppression. Commander Park addressed the liberated aliens through translation systems, and explained that Earth would not simply free them, but would help them rebuild their civilizations and reclaim their homeworlds, and the Vextar Empire's reign of terror was ending. The rescued beings included scientists and engineers and artists and philosophers who had been forced to work in mines and factories, and their skills and knowledge would be restored to their people, and their cultures would survive despite Vextar efforts to destroy them. Engineer Park analyzed captured Vextar technology and confirmed that their systems were decades behind human capabilities, and their energy weapons were primitive, and their shields were inadequate, and their computer networks were vulnerable to cyber warfare. The freed aliens chose to join humanity's liberation force, and their intimate knowledge of Vextar weaknesses and operational procedures would accelerate the campaign, and their motivation for revenge matched the humans who had lost friends to alien treachery. Captain Bay prepared his fleet for the next phase of operations, and intelligence indicated that Vextar commanders still believed the attack on HFY was an isolated incident, and they continued preparing their invasion of Earth without realizing that their empire was being systematically dismantled. Dr. Shin received combat data from the quantum weapons, and the results exceeded all theoretical predictions, and humanity's technological advantages were overwhelming, and the Vextar military would be unable to offer effective resistance against Earth's superior capabilities. The liberated species formed councils to coordinate their participation in the war effort, and representatives from 17 different worlds pledged their support for humanity's campaign, and their combined knowledge of Vextar territory and tactics would prove decisive. Lieutenant Nam's teams established secure communication networks among the freed aliens, and their coordination would enable resistance movements throughout Vextar space, and the Empire's control would crumble from within as slaves became soldiers. Commander Park received reports from other strike forces, and every target had been successfully neutralized, and thousands of aliens had been liberated, and Vextar military strength was being systematically destroyed without them realizing the scope of the assault. The Ghost of Terra and its sister ships departed HFY, carrying their rescued passengers, and leaving behind the wreckage of what had been a major Vextar installation, and the liberated aliens looked back at their former prison with tears of joy and hope. Fleet Admiral Kim Woo-jin commanded the largest human military force ever assembled, and his Earth Liberation Armada consisted of 300 warships and 50,000 soldiers and support vessels that stretched across light years of space, and the freed alien species had contributed their own ships and crews and knowledge that made victory inevitable. The war had escalated beyond anyone's expectations, and what began as strikes against isolated installations had become a systematic campaign to dismantle the entire Vextar Empire, and every liberated world revealed new horrors and new evidence that these aliens deserved no mercy. Colonel Han Ji-young's ground forces had perfected the art of planetary liberation, and her soldiers moved through Vextar installations like storms of destruction, and where the aliens expected easy conquest, they found humans who fought with precision and creativity and absolute determination. Dr. Lee Sun-hee studied captured Vextar psychological profiles, and her analysis revealed that their entire military doctrine was based on intimidation and overwhelming weaker opponents, and when faced with superior force, their morale collapsed rapidly and completely. The liberation of Kreshton had been a masterpiece of military planning, and the Vextar naval base had housed their invasion fleet intended for Earth, and Admiral Kim's forces had destroyed every ship and facility and freed thousands more slaves in a battle that lasted only 6 hours. The rescued aliens provided intelligence that transformed human understanding of Vexatar territory, and their empire controlled 12 star systems and enslaved 43 different species and maintained their power through terror and brutality that had continued for 3 centuries. Commander Park Jun-ho had been promoted to admiral after his success at Zefkai, and his tactical innovations had become standard doctrine for liberation operations, and his personal motivation for revenge had evolved into professional commitment to justice for all oppressed beings. The Free Systems Alliance formed naturally as liberated species organized their own military forces and chose Earth as their leader and protector, and humanity's role had expanded from Avenger to Liberator to Guardian of Galactic Freedom. Engineer Park Min-ho's technological innovations continued advancing human capabilities and captured Vextar equipment, revealed weaknesses that could be exploited, and new weapon systems emerged from the combination of human creativity and alien technology. The Vextar command structure began showing signs of panic as report after report described the complete destruction of military installations and the loss of slave labor camps, and the impossible technological superiority of the human forces. War Chief Grakthul himself took personal command of the defense efforts, and his broadcasts to Vextar forces revealed growing desperation as he tried to explain how a species they had planned to enslave was systematically destroying their empire. Colonel Han's planetary assault techniques had been refined through dozens of operations, and her forces could neutralize Vextar ground defenses within hours and liberate slave populations with minimal casualties, and the aliens had no effective counter to human tactical doctrine. The psychological impact of losing battle after battle without inflicting significant casualties on human forces was destroying. Vextar military morale and desertion rates climbed, and unit cohesion deteriorated, and their officers struggled to maintain discipline. Dr. Lee's research revealed that Vextar society was built entirely on the belief that might made right, and that superior force justified any action, and their inability to defeat humans was causing fundamental questions about their own legitimacy and purpose. Admiral Kim received reports from reconnaissance teams that had penetrated the outer defenses of Kethmora itself, and the Vextar homeworld was heavily fortified, but their defenses were designed to repel conventional attacks and would be useless against quantum weapons. The liberated species had formed their own military units within the Alliance fleet, and former slaves became soldiers eager for revenge against their oppressors, and their intimate knowledge of Vextar weaknesses made them devastatingly effective. Fighters Fleet Admiral Kim planned the final assault on the Vextar homeworld, and the operation would require careful coordination between human forces and allied species, and the goal was complete military defeat without unnecessary destruction of civilian populations. The technological advantages that Earth possessed had grown even greater as human scientists studied captured alien equipment and developed new weapons and defensive systems, and the gap between human and Vextar capabilities was now measured in centuries. Commander Park's strike forces had liberated 17 different worlds, and each victory revealed new evidence of Vextar crimes and systematic oppression and genocide and cultural destruction that demanded complete justice and accountability. Colonel Han's ground troops had perfected urban warfare techniques that minimized civilian casualties, while maximizing destruction of military targets, and their precision and effectiveness had become legendary among both human and allied forces. Dr. Lee's psychological warfare broadcasts were transmitted throughout Vextar space, and the messages explained that resistance was futile and surrender was the only option for survival, and the aliens who had used fear as a weapon now experienced terror themselves. The Vextar attempted to negotiate through intermediary species, but Admiral Kim refused all overtures, and humanity's position was clear that only complete surrender and accountability for war crimes would be acceptable. Engineer Park's latest innovations included personal energy, shields for ground troops, and enhanced quantum weapons that could disable entire installations without destroying them, and communication systems that could not be jammed or intercepted. The Free Systems Alliance had grown to include 43 liberated species, and their combined knowledge of Vextar territory and tactics and technology had made human victory not just possible, but inevitable. War Chief Grakthul's broadcasts became increasingly desperate as his forces were systematically destroyed, and his calls for reinforcements went unanswered because there were no reserves left, and his empire was collapsing around him. The final battle for the Vextar homeworld began with Admiral Kim's fleet emerging from hyperspace at the edge of the Kethmora system, and their arrival was detected immediately, but the defensive forces were inadequate to resist the assembled armada. Colonel Han's assault troops prepared for the liberation of the Vextar homeworld, and their mission was to capture war criminals and destroy military installations while protecting civilian populations, and the operation would require unprecedented precision and coordination. Dr. Lee monitored Vextar communications and detected panic spreading through their command structure as officers realized that defeat was certain, and their only choices were surrender or death, and many began abandoning their posts. The orbital battle for Kethmora lasted 12 hours, and Vextar defenses that had protected their homeworld for centuries were systematically dismantled by quantum weapons and superior tactics and overwhelming force fleet. Admiral Kim coordinated the assault from his flagship and watched as enemy installations were neutralized one by one, and the Vextar fleet was destroyed without inflicting significant damage on human or allied forces. Engineer Park's technology allowed precise targeting that destroyed military facilities while leaving civilian infrastructure intact, and the EE goal was to end Vextar military capability without creating a humanitarian disaster. The liberated species fought alongside human forces with determination born of centuries of oppression, and their courage and skill had proven that they were natural allies and partners in the struggle for galactic freedom. Commander Park led the assault on the planetary defense grid, and his forces penetrated Vextar shields and destroyed command centers and weapon platforms and communication arrays with surgical precision. Colonel Han's troops landed on Kethmora's surface and began capturing strategic locations and arresting war criminals and liberating the final slave camps, and their efficiency and professionalism demonstrated human military superiority. Dr. Lee's analysis of Vextar surrender offers revealed that they still did not understand the magnitude of their defeat and believed they could negotiate from a position of strength despite having lost everything. War Chief Grakthul himself was captured while attempting to flee the planet, and the alien who had ordered the execution of Earth's diplomatic mission was brought before Admiral Kim in chains and defeated. The Vextar Empire had been completely dismantled and their military destroyed, and their slaves liberated and their homeworld occupied, and 3 centuries of oppression and terror had ended in total defeat. Fleet Admiral Kim received surrender documents from the remaining Vextar commanders, and their acceptance of unconditional defeat marked the end of organized resistance and the beginning of accountability for their crimes. The Free Systems Alliance prepared to establish new governments on liberated worlds and to restore freedom and dignity to species that had suffered under Vextar rule for generations, and humanity would help them rebuild. The reckoning was complete, and the Vextar Empire that had planned to enslave humanity had been destroyed by the very species they had underestimated, and the galaxy would remember what happened when peaceful intentions were answered with violence. President Imdeho stood before the assembled representatives of 43 liberated species, and the weight of deciding the fate of an entire empire rested on his shoulders, and the chamber on Kethmora, where Vextar leaders once planned conquests. now hosted the tribunal that would determine justice for centuries of oppression. War Chief Grakthul sat in restraints before the assembly, and his massive frame seemed diminished by defeat, and the alien who had ordered the execution of Ambassador Choi Hyawan and her diplomatic team now faced judgment from the species he had planned to enslave. Admiral Song Yunji commanded the occupation forces that had taken control of the Vextar homeworld, and her soldiers maintained order while ensuring that civilian populations received medical care and food and protection, and the contrast between human treatment of defeated enemies and Vextar brutality toward slaves was stark. The collective voice spoke for all liberated species, and their representatives had traveled from dozens of worlds to witness the final judgment of their former oppressors, and their testimonies revealed the full scope of Vexitar crimes and the suffering they had endured. President Im activated the communication system that would broadcast his words throughout known space, and his speech would be transmitted to every world and every species and every civilization that might be watching, and the message would establish humanity's principles for galactic governance. The evidence against the Vextar leadership filled massive databanks and included recordings of executions and documentation of slave labor camps and proof of genocide and cultural destruction and biological experiments and systematic oppression that had continued for 3 centuries. Grakthul attempted to speak in his own defense, but the words rang hollow when faced with the testimonies of survivors and the documentation of atrocities, and his claims that the Vextar only conquered aggressive species were contradicted by overwhelming evidence. Admiral Song reported that the dismantling of Vextar military infrastructure was proceeding ahead of schedule, and weapons factories had been converted to civilian manufacturing, and warships had been scrapped, and military bases had been transformed into humanitarian aid centers. The liberated species had formed new governments based on democratic principles, and human advisors helped establish constitutions and legal systems and educational institutions that would prevent future tyranny and ensure lasting freedom. President Im began his address with images from the diplomatic massacre that had started the war, and the footage of Ambassador Choi's execution played once again as a reminder of how the conflict began and why it had been necessary. You showed the galaxy who you were when you answered our offer of peace with murder and treachery, and you believed that brutality and intimidation would make you strong, and you planned to enslave humanity, just as you enslaved 43 other species. The president's voice remained calm and measured as he detailed the evidence of Vextar crimes and the systematic nature of their oppression and their plans for expanding their empire through conquest and slavery, and their complete disregard for the rights of other beings. Now we show the galaxy who we are, and we came not as conquerors, but as liberators, and we fought not for territory, but for justice. And we will not repeat your mistakes or become the tyrants that we defeated. The collective voice presented their demands for justice, and the liberated species wanted accountability for those responsible for genocide and reparations for destroyed cultures, and guarantees that such oppression would never again be permitted, and the establishment of protections for all sentient beings. Admiral Song's forces had documented every aspect of Vextar society and government and military structure, and the evidence would be preserved for future generations to study and remember and learn from, and ensure that such tyranny could never again take root. Grakthul and his senior commanders were sentenced to life imprisonment for war crimes and crimes against sentient beings and genocide, and their military rank and honors were stripped away, and they would spend their remaining days knowing that their empire had been completely destroyed. The Vextar civilian population was not held responsible for the crimes of their leaders, and human aid workers provided medical care and education and assistance in building new democratic institutions, and the goal was rehabilitation rather than revenge. President Im announced the establishment of the Terran Protectorate, and Earth would guarantee the freedom and independence of all liberated worlds and provide military protection against future threats and assist in rebuilding civilizations that had been nearly destroyed. The former slave species reclaimed their homeworlds and began the long process of cultural restoration and reconnection with their heritage, and human scholars and artists and scientists assisted in recovering knowledge and traditions that the Vextar had tried to erase. Admiral Song oversaw the Distribution of Vextar territory among the liberated species and planets that had been mining colonies became independent worlds, and resources that had been stolen were returned to their rightful owners, and fair compensation was provided for. Generations of exploitation. The technology captured from the Vextar was shared freely among the Alliance members, and human scientists worked with alien researchers to develop new innovations that would benefit all species, and the knowledge gained from the conflict would serve peaceful purposes. Dr. Lee Sun-hee's psychological analysis of Vextar leadership revealed that their empire had been built on fear, and their defeat had shattered their worldview, and many former officers expressed genuine remorse for their actions when faced with the evidence of their crimes. The Free Systems Alliance formally elected Earth as their protector and leader, and humanity accepted the responsibility with humility and determination, and the principles that had guided the liberation would continue to guide the Peace Commander. Park Jun-ho was promoted to Admiral and given command of the new Harmony Station that would serve as headquarters for the Terran Protectorate, and the name honored the ship and crew that had started the war by surviving the diplomatic massacre. Engineer Park Min-ho's technological innovations were shared throughout the Alliance, and cloaking devices and quantum weapons and advanced communication systems would be used to defend freedom rather than conquer territory, and the tools of war became instruments of peace. The former Vextar homeworld of Kethmora was transformed into a memorial and education center where future generations could learn about the consequences of tyranny and the importance of justice and the courage required to stand against oppression. President Im concluded his address with a promise that humanity would never again allow such suffering to occur in any part of the galaxy, and that peaceful species would always have Earth's protection, and that those who chose violence would face the same fate as the Vextar Empire. The galaxy had learned new truths about humanity and Earth's capacity for both peace and war, and the species that had offered friendship to the stars had proven that kindness was not weakness, and that justice backed by strength could overcome any tyranny. War Chief Grakthol spent his final years in confinement writing memoirs that warned other potential aggressors about the true nature of humanity, and his words became required. Reading in military academies throughout known space as an example of strategic failure. The reconstruction of liberated worlds proceeded rapidly with human assistance and engineering. Teams and medical personnel and teachers helped rebuild what the Vextar had destroyed and create better societies based on freedom and dignity. Admiral Song's peacekeeping forces maintained stability throughout former Vextar territory, and their presence ensured that no new tyrants could arise and that democratic institutions had time to establish themselves and grow strong. The collective voice established the Memorial Day of Liberation that would be observed annually throughout the Alliance, and the celebration would honor those who had suffered under Vextar rule and those who had fought for freedom. President Im's words were carved into monuments on every liberated world and translated into every known language and preserved for posterity as a reminder that peaceful intentions must be backed by the strength to defend them. The transformation was complete, and 43 enslaved species had become free citizens of democratic societies, and humanity had evolved from naive idealists to pragmatic protectors of galactic civilization. Admiral Park Jun-ho stood on the observation deck of Harmony Station and watched ships from dozens of worlds arriving for the first Free Systems Alliance assembly, and representatives of species that had been slaves now participated as equals in shaping the future. A young officer asked whether humanity would ever return to the pure pacifism that had characterized the diplomatic mission to Kethmora, and Admiral Park's response became part of Alliance doctrine. We will always offer the olive branch first, because peace is what we truly want. But they will never again mistake our kindness for weakness, because we have shown the galaxy what happens when peaceful intentions are answered with violence. The lesson had been written in the debris of the Vextar Empire, and the freedom of 43 worlds, and the establishment of protections that would prevent future oppression, and the galaxy would remember.